Hey everybody, this is your Right Geek, honorary man king, and leader of the Awkward Cough Squad, here with part 2 of our top 10 episodes of DS9. So, yesterday I talked about places 10 through 6. Today I'm going to talk about the top 5, starting with the episode in 5th place, which is the 8th episode of Season 2, Necessary Evil. This is the one in which Odo discovers that an old murder mystery from the Cardassian era has opened up again, and it turns out that Kira was the murderer during her terrorist period. It is easy to see why the cast and crew are proud of this episode. It brings to life the moral ambiguities of warfare with an adeptness that will come to be another DS9 hallmark, and in the process deepens an existing relationship. In fact, this is the first episode in which Odo acknowledges that he not only respects Kira, but loves her as well. The juxtaposition of this personal revelation and Odo's simultaneous professional revelation that Kira was a murderer creates a very interesting tension indeed. Beyond the central story, this episode also cleverly appropriates the conventions of classic film noir. That's why a lot of people actually call this episode Deep Space Noir, because that's what it is. Odo's logs echo noir's use of first-person narration. The switching between present and past is yet another nod, and if I might talk about a production choice for a moment, even this episode's use of lighting, or lack thereof, is influenced by noir. And it was also just interesting to go back to what the station was like when the Cardassians were in charge. In 4th place, the 2nd episode of 4th season, The Visitor. This is the one in which an accident in engineering sucks Ben Sisko into an alternate dimension, and we see Jake Sisko basically live an entire life without his father, except for the periodic times when Sisko would be snapped back into Jake's dimension. So Jake never really got a chance to get over his father's loss. Several things to appreciate here artistically. First, the writer of the script actually had to do a fair bit of world building. This version of the future included significant political intrigue, amusing anecdotes about the cultural backdrop on DS9, and a whole life to describe for Jake himself. I actually found much of the story compelling, and the Visitor future has spawned countless fanfic developments, which is a sign that author Michael Taylor did a very believable and fascinating job telling such a small story and making it feel like it belongs in the larger canon. Second, this episode has a marvelous understanding of the two key characters, and how they would respond to a tragedy like the accident on the Defiant. The way in which his father's incomplete passing consumes Jake's every thought for a lifetime is exactly how I picture it for someone like him, particularly someone with his history. How many times have we seen Jake paralyzed at a moment of decision until his father gives him the words of wisdom or support or praise that he so desperately needs? Jake and Ben have an enviably close and wonderfully supportive bond. And of course, Jake is a writer, an obsessive writer at that. He has his father's tenacity and an artist's tendency toward perfectionism. He would be exactly the kind of person I'd expect to dedicate his life to fixing a perceived mistake, like giving up on his father. Even though, as we viewers know, it was surely not a mistake. And Ben, you better believe I could see Ben selflessly begging his son to move on and look to the future. Third, the presentation is exquisite. The score is not wholly original. We've heard the romantic requiem before. I believe The Visitor marks the second time that particular piece was used, but it's certainly deeply emotionally effective the way it's used. The film work is gorgeous and intimate, bringing us closer to the story, as we need to be for the messages to reach us to the very depths of our souls. The choices for where to place act outs and temporal transitions were non-intrusive, very important with a story like this. I can't think of a single thing they did wrong in preparing the script, directing, or producing this episode. In every war, 3 lists are compiled: the wounded, the confirmed dead, and the missing in action. On occasion, I have sometimes wondered what it must be like to be a mother, father, sister, or brother of a soldier on the third list. What it must be like to be forever locked in limbo. Many of these families have probably moved on, but have they done so in complete comfort? Do they still, in quieter moments, hope that their missing relatives will turn up alive? Do they sometimes wish these missing soldiers would be confirmed dead after all, so they wouldn't have to keep wondering? Have they ever experienced the peace of closure? A confirmed death brings a pain of its own, but, and this is true whether you believe in God or not, at least with death, you know your relative is safe beyond caring, and knowing that, you can definitely get on with your life. No one I love is missing in action, but I do have an imagination that can conjure up any number of possible human responses to such a circumstance. It is this power of imagination that draws me into the story Taylor tells in The Visitor. The grief that follows a simple and conclusive death usually fades, but here Jake is simply not allowed to move beyond that moment of loss. His grief is repeatedly and cruelly renewed every time his father makes another all-too-fleeting appearance in his life. I'm personally very glad Babylon 5's The Coming of Shadows won the Hugo in that particular year, but that doesn't mean I don't respect and love how profoundly devastating and emotionally true every bit of this script is. Everything this alternate Jake does, from lingering on the station, to going back to graduate school, to sacrificing his life for the sake of his younger self, makes perfect psychological sense. In third place, the second episode of 6th season, Rocks and Shoals. The first highlight of this episode is, of course, DS9's mastery of gallows humor. Oh no, I tore my pants. Trust me, it cracks me up every time. So this is the one that takes place in the 6th episode opening arc of the 6th season, in which the crew of the Defiant crash lands on a planet, and they end up encountering a Jem'Hadar squad. And there's negotiations going on with that in terms of who's going to surrender to who. Meanwhile, on the station, we have Kira becoming increasingly uncomfortable with her position as the Dominion has occupied the station. Second, we have the juxtaposition of the, once again, honorable Jem'Hadar. It's not their fault they were bred to be our ultimate enemy. Their honor code is remarkable, despite their savage genetic nature. With the, less than honorable Vorta. Kevin isn't an outlier. Weyoun will demonstrate the same capacity for self-preservation, manipulation, and deviousness, traits of which the Ferengi would be jealous. But in this plot, it feels particularly loathsome to watch, and Avery Brooks nails it with his reaction to Kevin's final line. And finally, there is Sisko's attempts to salvage a solution fit for Starfleet, something that feels a bit more moral than what Kevin proposes, and his decisiveness in taking command of the situation. He is correct that it's his call, and not a debate. He's correct to try to turn the Jem'Hadar against their Vorta. He's correct to offer them their lives, and he's correct, albeit grimly, to gun them down when left with no other choice. And then Matt says, though my girlfriend did raise a valid question, why not stun the Jem'Hadar just to say F you to their Vorta? It is said that if you try to put okay, and then this is me talking about the other part, the station part. It is said that if you try to put a frog in hot water, it will jump right back out again, but if that same frog is gradually brought to a boil, it will sit there and die, because it doesn't perceive what's happening until it's too late. In a similar fashion, people are more likely to accept the rule of a despot if his regime is built incrementally. Hitler didn't unveil his entire plan for the Third Reich in one fell swoop. He rolled it out in stages in the hopes that he could lull the Allied powers into a false sense of security, and for a while it worked. So what does this have to do with Rocks and Shoals? Well, Weyoun and his Dominion masters operates according to the same folk wisdom that animated Hitler. He blocks Dukat, not because he's actually concerned for the Bajoran people and their rights, but because he believes a subtle encroachment will give the Dominion a diplomatic advantage. And once again, this Nazi strategy proves to be dangerously effective. Indeed, as we see in this episode, even an old rebel like Kira can be fooled by it. But not for long, because this episode's purpose, in part, is to violently yank Kira out of the pot before she is boiled. And Moore and Bejar accomplish this with stunning direction and a remarkable economy of expression. The going-to-work sequences, they are things of pure beauty. Perhaps the finest embodiment of show don't tell that I have ever watched. And Yasim's suicide, minimalist, yet absolutely devastating. So now Kira has decided to start a second resistance, which is wholly appropriate given her personality, her history, and her recent frustrations. And actually, I have to wonder if Sisko planned it this way. After all, he's known Kira for years now. Surely he was aware that his first officer would not rest easy so long as the Dominion and Dukat had control of DS9. Maybe, just maybe, his advocating for Bajora neutrality was less a message to stay out of the fighting and more a message to fight quietly. Such a tactical maneuvering seems in keeping with Sisko's character. Now we have the episode in second place, the 18th episode of Season 1, Duet. When I was 13 or 14, I memorized this episode and can recite every word on command. Yes, I was an enormous geek. I did this not simply because I idolized Major Kira, and I did this not simply because I was at the time rather concerned about reported ethnic cleansing in other parts of the world. No, I also learned this episode backwards and forwards because I appreciated the language. For example, after Kira triumphantly informs Maritza that his Kalanora has been confirmed, she crows, "If your lies are going to be this transparent, it's going to be a very short interrogation." To which Maritza retorts, "Well, in that case, I'll try to make my lies more opaque." The words! The words! Even now, I feel this very strong desire to foist this episode upon my students as a lesson in beauty and cleverness of expression. In the past, I have seen some reviewers critique this episode's Holocaust allegory as a little on the nose, but in this case, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Principally because, as discussed above, the dialogue is just so compellingly written, but also because said allegory is organic to the setting and the characters. Trek established the Bajorans as the victims of political oppression and genocide, long before DS9's writers decided to do their Holocaust story. And so it works. And the other interesting thing about Duet is that it forces Kira not to look at all Cardassians as if they are the same. That was basically the major theme of the episode. Which is interesting, especially in this day and age when people are now encouraged to, at least in certain ideologies, they're actually encouraged to think of all people who look like a particular ethnic group or category, to think of all of them as oppressors. But DS9 goes against that grain and says, no, just because many of the Cardassians were oppressors of the Bajorans doesn't mean that all Cardassians were. So, that's a nice little individualist take there. Okay, so that brings us to the first place slot. And for this, there is actually a tie, because my brother and I, we used to get into joking perennial fights about which one was the best one, until we finally settled on, you know what, it's a tie. Matt's selection, which he really, really wants to defend, is the 8th episode of 7th season, The Siege of AR-558. And what he says about this episode is the following. Why is Siege so effective? What makes it the sensational expression of the heroism and brutality of combat on the front lines that it is? Passion. All the directorial, technical, and professional choices of the cast, crew, and producers of the franchise involved in this episode took it as a personal mission and focused their minds on every key decision made in framing the story. A few examples. A decision was made early in the teleplay drafting to focus the episode on Bashir, Quark, Ezri, and Nog, because they were the least experienced members of the cast with frontline combat. O'Brien never appeared in the episode, Kira was used as a dramatic foil in the final scene, and Worf exited the battlefield with a Defiant, because all of them would be seasoned combat officers who would be less affected by this particular mission. The 4 characters that form the core of the script were meant to be different versions of, quote, us, the viewers, who have little concept of what combat is actually like, the civilians in the crowd. This worked beautifully, and each of the 4 characters chosen here contributed something completely unique and powerful to the story. Quark provided his most valuable asset, his outsider's perspective and heart of gold, pointing out that war turns good people into killers, even as they do heroic deeds. Nog was a necessary casualty. Losing a limb not only affected his future character development, but was also a direct blow to the audience. Ezri conveyed our vulnerability, as did Quark, especially in the beginning, and our sense of smallness in the face of the massive scale of war. Bashir was a sort of grim logical influence, focused on just what lengths they'll need to go through to survive. In war, our reactions to extreme stress and loss can vary. The show chose to portray 4 guest characters, each of them different. Vargas, the man suffering PTSD and coming apart under the pressure. Kellen, the gentle soul placed way out of his element and heroically soldiering on to his eventual death. Reese, the battle-hardened and darkened soul who has shut out the world in order to cope with this tragic environment. And Larkin, the natural leader who speaks for her men and women and leads their most dangerous missions. Not only that, but they spend time developing each and every one of these characters so that we feel like we know them, and then kill 3 of them in the siege or the prior scouting patrol. The varying perspectives on what it's like to live under these brutal conditions for months on end and face constant threat of death give us all cause to think about how we'd react and make us appreciate how miraculous and difficult battlefield sacrifice and heroism must be. So Matt loves the siege of AR-558 because he believes it's a very accurate depiction of what it's like to be right in the middle of combat. So it's a very, very good example of DS9 being what I called in a comment yesterday, the war trek. War is a big theme in the entire series, and the siege of AR-558 communicates that theme very well. And I have to agree with Matt that it is, in fact, a fine episode. But my choice for first place is 19th episode of 6th season, In the Pale Moonlight. This episode beautifully illustrates why Sisko is the man to put on the front lines in a time of total war, and why none of the other Trek captains could have possibly filled this role. Sorry. So this is the episode in which Sisko uses lies and deceits to get the Romulans to fight on the Federation's side in the Dominion War. But In the Pale Moonlight is a masterpiece for 2 other reasons. Number 1, it expertly utilizes the show's in-house alien perspectives. Obviously, Garrick's background as a spy for a non-Federation and totalitarian government, and his consequent willingness to pull off the very messy, very bloody solution, plays a central role in the unfolding of the plot. But I feel it is Quark who really delivers the coup de grace. Bringing Quark in as a collateral victim of Sisko and Garrick's scheme, and allowing the Ferengi to gloat over Sisko's moment of moral compromise, is a brilliant way to twist the knife. Secondly, this episode underscores, with at least 2 bold lines, the Federation's vulnerability. As the events surrounding the fall of Beta Z indicate, the Federation's status as the Alpha Quadrant's benign hegemony has lulled its members into a false sense of security. But let's look beyond the casualty lists, the constant retreats, and the Dominion invasion of a semi-major and centrally situated Federation planet and consider this. Sisko is not a lone wolf here. He lies, cheats, bribes men to cover the crimes of other men, and, oh yes, also becomes an accessory to murder. But he does it all with Starfleet's blessing. I seriously want you, dear listener, to ponder that for a moment, and then tell me whether or not you too feel the sinking feeling of, oh crap, in the pit of your stomach. I honestly don't think there's a more effective way to communicate the reality that the Federation has found itself in a conflict with a truly existential threat than to show its military officers, from the brass on down, violating Federation principle out of sheer desperation. Damn. So In the Pale Moonlight, once again, is another masterful example of DS9 being the war trek and grappling with the ethics of war and what exactly is permissible and what exactly is not when you are facing basically the threat of extinction from an enemy that is extraordinarily powerful and might, in fact, wipe you out and wipe out your freedom if they were to succeed. So that is my top 10 episodes of DS9. If there are any episodes that you love that were not on this list, I have a feeling they're probably in our honorable mentions list. We had a lot of other episodes that were rated very highly. They just didn't hit the top 10. So if you have episodes that you did not hear here that you would like to discuss, certainly do so in the comments below, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.